The whistle screamed and the train pulled away, and Eleanor Whitmore stood alone on the platform with nothing in her hands but a torn glove. Her trunk was gone. Her betrothed was gone. The porter who had promised to watch her belongings only shrugged and pointed at the empty track, as if the answer to her question had already left with the smoke. She turned in a slow circle, searching the thinning crowd for a face she recognized, but there was none. Edmund Hale, the man she was to marry in 11 days, had simply vanished between one platform and the next, and he had taken her trunk, her letters, and her good name with him. A few passengers lingered to stare. A woman in a gray bonnet whispered something to her companion, and both women laughed behind gloved hands. Eleanor felt her face burn, but she lifted her chin anyway, because crying in front of strangers would only give them more to talk about on their journeys home. She had left her aunt's house that morning believing she was traveling toward a wedding. Instead, she was standing in a strange town, in a dress already dusty from the road, with 3 shillings sewn into the hem of her petticoat and no way to reach anyone who might help her. The station clock read 4:30. The light was already beginning to slant gold and low across the tracks, and soon it would be evening, and she would still be standing here with nowhere to go. She approached the station master, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, and asked if a gentleman named Edmund Hale had left any message for her. The station master checked a ledger, shook his head, and told her, not unkindly, that no message had been left, and that the last train to the city had already departed. There would not be another until morning. Eleanor thanked him and stepped back outside onto the platform, her mind spinning through every possibility. Perhaps Edmund had been delayed by an emergency. Perhaps he had gone ahead to secure lodging and would send for her. But even as she tried to construct these explanations, she remembered the strange coolness in his letters over the past month, the way he had stopped speaking of their future together and started speaking only of his family's expectations. She had ignored the signs because she had wanted, so badly, to believe in him. Now she had nothing to believe in but the empty track and the cold air rolling in from the hills. A carriage rattled past on the road beyond the station fence, black and gleaming, drawn by 4 matched horses, with a crest on the door that she did not recognize. It did not stop. She watched it disappear around the bend, and told herself it was nothing to her, that carriages belonging to fine families had no business with a woman abandoned on a railway platform. She sat down on a wooden bench near the ticket window, and tried to think clearly. She could write to her aunt, but the post office had already closed for the evening. She could ask the station master for the name of a respectable inn, but 3 shillings would not stretch far, and pride kept her from admitting, even to herself, how little she had. She thought of walking. She thought of the miles of unfamiliar road ahead of her and the coming dark, and for the first time since the train had pulled away, fear settled into her chest like a stone. A young boy selling newspapers approached her and asked if she wanted the evening edition. She shook her head, then changed her mind and asked him instead if he knew of any family in the area with a black carriage and a crest showing a hawk. The boy's eyes widened. That would be the Duke's carriage, he told her. Duke of Camden. Everyone around here knew his crest. He rarely came through the village himself, but his carriage passed through sometimes, carrying messages or supplies to the estate beyond the hill. Eleanor thanked him and gave him a coin from her carefully guarded 3 shillings, more out of habit and courtesy than anything else. The boy ran off and she was alone again, watching the sky deepen from gold to a bruised violet. She thought of her aunt, waiting at home, expecting a letter announcing a happy arrival at Edmund's family estate. She thought of the wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe, half finished, the hem still needing to be let down. She thought of every small sacrifice she had made in the past year to prepare for a life she now understood might never come to pass, and she pressed her lips together to keep from weeping in public. The station master was preparing to lock the small waiting room for the night. He glanced at her with something like pity and told her she was welcome to sit inside a while longer, out of the wind, but that he could not leave the building open past dark. Eleanor nodded and thanked him, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. She had just risen from the bench, resigned to walking toward the lights of the village in search of the cheapest possible room, when she heard the sound of hooves again, closer this time, and turning fast. She looked up to see the same black carriage from before, the one bearing the hawk crest, slowing as it approached the station gate. It stopped directly in front of her. For a long moment nothing happened. The horses stamped and blew steam into the cooling air. Then the carriage door opened and a footman stepped down, his livery neat and dark, his expression carefully composed. He looked at Eleanor as though he had been searching for her specifically, which, she would soon learn, he had. He asked, with careful formality, if she was the young lady who had been left at the station that afternoon. Eleanor's heart began to pound. She did not know how anyone could know such a thing, unless someone at the station had already spread the story through the village, the way stories always spread in small places. She answered carefully that she was, and asked who wished to know. The footman explained that his master, the Duke of Camden, had passed this way earlier in the afternoon, and had observed her on the platform through the carriage window. He had noticed her distress, and upon learning from his own household that no word had come of any young lady expected at a nearby estate, he had made inquiries in the village. When those inquiries confirmed that a gentleman named Hale had boarded a different train alone, leaving a young woman and her belongings behind, the Duke had given orders for the carriage to return. Eleanor stood very still, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. A duke, a man she had never met, had noticed her from a passing carriage and troubled himself to send for her. It seemed impossible, the kind of thing that happened only in the pages of a novel, and yet the carriage stood before her, solid and real, its lanterns now lit against the falling dark. She asked the footman what the Duke intended. The footman said only that his master wished to offer her shelter for the night, and safe passage wherever she needed to go once arrangements could be made. He assured her that a maid would accompany them, and that nothing about the arrangement need trouble her reputation. Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct told her that a woman alone should not climb into a stranger's carriage, duke or otherwise, no matter how respectable the offer appeared. But she also understood, with the plain clarity of someone who has run out of better options, that the night ahead offered her nothing but cold roads and closed doors. She had 3 shillings, no trunk, and no one in the world who knew where she was. She asked if she might have a moment. The footman nodded and stepped back respectfully. Eleanor turned toward the darkening hills, toward the direction her train had come from, and felt the weight of everything she had lost that day settle over her like a heavy coat. Her betrothed, her plans, the life she had spent a year building in her mind, brick by careful brick. But when she turned back to the carriage, she saw, through the open door, an older woman already seated inside, a lady's maid by her dress, offering a small, encouraging nod, as though to say that everything would be handled with propriety. Eleanor took a breath, gathered what remained of her composure, and walked toward the carriage. As the footman helped her step up into the warmth of the interior, she asked one final question, more to herself than to him. Why would a duke concern himself with a stranger left behind at a railway station? The footman, closing the door softly behind her, only said that the duke did not care to explain his reasons, but that he rarely acted without one. The carriage pulled away from the station, the lanterns swinging gently, and Eleanor Whitmore, who that morning had believed she was traveling toward her wedding, now found herself traveling instead toward a house she had never seen, belonging to a man she had never met, carried forward by nothing but a stranger's unexplained kindness and the last of the evening light. The road climbed slowly out of the village, past hedgerows silvered with the last light, and Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass of the carriage window, watching the world she knew grow smaller behind her. The lady's maid, who introduced herself as Mrs. Fenwick, offered her a woolen blanket and a flask of warm tea, and spoke in a gentle, unhurried voice about nothing in particular, the weather, the roughness of the road, the way the moon was rising early tonight. Eleanor understood that the woman was trying to put her at ease, and she was grateful for it, even as her thoughts kept circling back to Edmund and the trunk he had left behind on some other train, rattling toward a future that no longer included her. She thought of the letter she would need to write to her aunt, and how she would explain any of this without sounding as though she had lost her senses. A duke's carriage, a stranger's kindness. It would sound, on paper, like the beginning of a scandal rather than the end of one. And yet what choice had she truly had, standing on that platform with the dark coming down and nowhere else to turn? Mrs. Fenwick, perhaps sensing the direction of her thoughts, told her gently that the Duke was known in the county for being exacting in private, but never for being unkind, and that whatever his reasons for sending the carriage back, they would not include harm to her. Eleanor wanted to believe her. She studied the older woman's face in the lantern light, and found nothing there but calm reassurance, which steadied her more than she expected. The carriage rounded a final bend, and through the window Eleanor caught her first glimpse of a great house rising against the darkening sky, its windows lit gold, its chimneys sending thin threads of smoke into the night air. She had no way of knowing, as the horses slowed before the long gravel drive, that the man waiting somewhere behind those lit windows had already decided, in the space of one afternoon, that her arrival would change the shape of his carefully guarded life. She only knew that the platform, and the life she had lost upon it, was now far behind her, and that somewhere ahead, a stranger's unexplained kindness was about to become the strangest turn her story had ever taken. The great doors of the house opened before the carriage had fully stopped, and Eleanor stepped down into a courtyard lit by iron lanterns, her legs unsteady after the long ride and the longer day behind it. A butler met them at the threshold, his manner formal but not cold, and led her through a hall lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her progress. She had never in her life stood inside a house so grand, and she was suddenly, sharply aware of the state of her dress, dust-streaked and travel-worn, entirely unsuited to the polished floors beneath her feet. She was shown into a study where a fire burned low in the grate, and there, standing near the window with his back to her, was a tall man in dark clothes who did not turn immediately when she entered. When he did, Eleanor found herself facing a face that was neither warm nor cold, but simply watchful, as though he were still deciding what to make of her. He introduced himself as Julian Ashford, Duke of Camden, and asked, without preamble, if she was recovered enough from the journey to answer a few questions. Eleanor, still standing just inside the doorway, said that she was. He asked her name, and she gave it. He asked whether the gentleman who had left her at the station was known to her family, and she explained, as steadily as she could manage, that Edmund Hale had been her betrothed, and that they were to have been married within the fortnight. Saying the words aloud in this cold and formal room made the truth of her situation land on her all over again, and she had to pause before continuing. The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he asked only one further question. Did she wish to pursue the matter, through her family or through the law, or did she wish simply to return home and put the incident behind her? Eleanor admitted she did not know. She had not yet had time to think past the next hour, let alone the shape of her future. The Duke nodded, as though this answer did not surprise him, and told her that whatever she decided, she was welcome to remain under his roof until arrangements could be made for her comfortably and safely to return to her aunt. He explained the terms plainly, in the manner of a man accustomed to laying out agreements rather than making promises. She would be given a room in the West Wing, near his grandmother's chambers. She would take her meals with the household, though not necessarily with him, given the demands of his own affairs. And in exchange for his hospitality, he asked only that she consider assisting his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, who had been in poor health, and who found the company of most people tiresome, but who might, he thought, tolerate a companion of good sense and quiet manner. Eleanor understood the offer for what it was, generosity wrapped carefully in practicality, so that neither party need feel the weight of charity. She agreed at once, grateful for the chance to be useful rather than simply pitied. The Duke's expression eased slightly at her answer, though only slightly. He added, with a directness that startled her, that he would ask one further thing of her. Whatever occurred within these walls, he wished no whisper of scandal to attach itself to his household. He had position and responsibilities that could not withstand careless talk, and he trusted she understood the delicacy of a young unmarried woman residing, however innocently, under a bachelor duke's roof. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the implication, though she understood his caution was fair. She assured him she wanted nothing more than to remain unremarked upon, to recover quietly, and to trouble him as little as possible. The Duke studied her for a long moment, as though weighing the sincerity of her words, then inclined his head and said that would suit them both. A maid was summoned to show her to her room, and as Eleanor turned to leave, the Duke spoke once more, his voice quieter now. He said that no one deserved to be abandoned on a platform like unwanted luggage, and that whatever Edmund Hale's reasons had been, they reflected poorly on him and not on her. Eleanor did not know how to answer such an unexpected kindness, so she only thanked him and followed the maid out into the hall. Her room, when she reached it, was larger and finer than any she had slept in before, with a fire already lit and a nightdress laid out that Mrs. Fenwick must have arranged in anticipation of her arrival. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at the flames, turning over the strange turns of the day. That morning she had woken expecting a wedding. Tonight she was a guest, or perhaps something less defined than a guest, in the house of a duke who spoke to her as though she were neither an inconvenience nor a curiosity, but simply a person who had suffered an injustice and deserved fair treatment. The following morning she was taken to meet the Dowager Duchess, and found a small, sharp-eyed woman propped among pillows, who studied Eleanor from head to foot before speaking a single word. "You are the girl from the station," the old woman said, more statement than question. "My grandson has never once in his life brought home a stray creature, human or otherwise, so you must be either very unfortunate or very interesting. I confess I have not yet decided which." Eleanor, startled into honesty, said she rather thought she was both. The Duchess barked out a short laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement Eleanor had heard since arriving, and told her to sit down and stop hovering like a servant waiting to be dismissed. Over the following days, Eleanor settled into a routine that felt, despite its strangeness, steadier than anything she had known in months. She read to the Duchess in the mornings, walked with her in the gardens when her health allowed it, and listened to her sharp, often unkind, always entertaining observations about the family and the household around them. The Duchess, Eleanor quickly learned, missed very little. It was the Duchess who first mentioned the cousin. Priscilla Vane, the old woman said one afternoon, watching Eleanor closely as she spoke, was the daughter of Julian's late father's younger brother, and had lived at Camden House on and off since her own family's fortunes had declined. She had long assumed, the Duchess said bluntly, that she would one day marry Julian herself, uniting what remained of her branch's wealth with his title. That assumption had never been encouraged by Julian, but neither had it been firmly discouraged, and Priscilla was not a woman who abandoned a plan easily. Eleanor absorbed this information carefully, understanding at once why she had felt, more than once in the past 2 days, a pair of eyes watching her from doorways and stairwells that did not belong to servants. She met Priscilla properly that evening. At a small family supper the Duke had arranged, apparently to formally introduce Eleanor to the household, and put an end to any confused gossip among the staff before it could spread further. Priscilla was beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, her smile perfectly composed even as her eyes moved over Eleanor's borrowed dress with obvious calculation. She asked, in a voice pitched just sweetly enough to sound like curiosity rather than accusation, how long dear Eleanor intended to stay. Eleanor answered as evenly as she could that she hoped only to remain until arrangements could be made for her return home, and that she was deeply grateful for the Duke's hospitality in the meantime. Priscilla's smile did not waver, but something behind it sharpened, and Eleanor understood, with the plain instinct of someone who has just been quietly measured and found threatening, that she had made an enemy without saying or doing anything at all. The Duke, seated at the head of the table, seemed to notice the exchange, though he said nothing at the time. Later, as the supper ended and the household began to disperse, he found a moment to walk with Eleanor briefly through the hall, and told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that she should not trouble herself over Priscilla's manner, which he described only as a habit she had never quite outgrown. Eleanor thanked him, though she suspected the matter was not so simple as he made it sound, and that whatever quiet war had just begun over the supper table, it would not end so easily. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm. Eleanor rose early, before the rest of the house stirred, and took her breakfast in the small morning room overlooking the gardens, where the light came in soft and gray and the world felt, for a little while, uncomplicated. She had always been an early riser, a habit her aunt used to scold out of her, insisting that a proper young lady kept fashionable hours, but here, in this vast unfamiliar house, the quiet mornings became the one part of the day that belonged entirely to her. It was during one such morning that she encountered the Duke unexpectedly, seated alone at the far end of the breakfast table with a stack of papers and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke, caught in the small awkwardness of two people who had not expected company. He gestured for her to sit, if she wished, and she did, choosing a chair a respectful distance from his papers. He asked, somewhat stiffly, whether she had slept well, and she answered that she had, better than she expected, given the strangeness of the week behind her. He nodded, as though satisfied, and returned his attention to his papers, and Eleanor thought that would be the end of the conversation. Instead, after a long pause, he asked her a question that surprised her. He wanted to know what she had planned to do, before Edmund Hale had entered her life. Had she always intended to marry, or had there been some other ambition she had set aside? Eleanor considered the question carefully, unused to being asked about herself in any depth. She admitted that she had once hoped to open a small school, somewhere quiet, for girls whose families could not afford the fashionable academies, but who deserved an education all the same. Her aunt had thought the idea impractical for a woman soon to be married, and Eleanor had let the dream fold itself away, the way she had let so many other things fold away in the past year, in favor of the life she believed she was building with Edmund. The Duke listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only that it did not sound impractical to him, merely inconvenient to people who preferred women's ambitions to stay small. Eleanor looked up at him in surprise, unused to hearing such an opinion spoken so plainly, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between curiosity and quiet respect. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the household steward, bearing urgent correspondence regarding one of the Duke's tenant farms. and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. But Eleanor carried it with her through the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind the way one turns over an unexpected gift, unsure yet what to make of it. Priscilla noticed the shift as well, though she said nothing directly. Eleanor began to feel her presence more keenly in the days that followed, in the way conversations seemed to quiet when she entered a room, in the pointed compliments Priscilla paid her borrowed dresses, each one a small reminder that Eleanor owned nothing of her own beneath this roof. Eleanor bore it as best she could, reminding herself that her stay was temporary, and that soon enough she would return to her aunt's house, and this strange chapter would close behind her like a door. But the letter she needed to write to her aunt proved harder to compose than she expected. Each evening she sat at the small writing desk in her room, pen in hand, and each evening she found herself unable to explain, in any way that sounded sensible on paper, how she had come to be a guest in a duke's household rather than a bride in her husband's home. She began several drafts and abandoned them all, ashamed at how thin her explanations sounded, how easily they might be misread by anyone eager to think the worst. It was the Dowager Duchess, sharp-eyed as ever, who noticed her trouble one afternoon in the garden, and asked bluntly what was keeping her from finishing whatever letter she had clearly been struggling with for days. Eleanor admitted the truth, and the old woman laughed, not unkindly, and told her that half of what made a scandal was the guilty manner in which people tried to explain themselves. Write the truth plainly, she advised, and let anyone who wishes to think ill of it do so at their own expense. Eleanor took the advice to heart, and that evening finally finished a letter she felt she could send, simple and honest, describing the abandonment at the station and the Duke's unexpected kindness in nearly the same plain terms the old woman had used. She sealed it and gave it to a footman to post the following morning, and felt, for the first time since the train had pulled away without her, a small measure of her old composure returning. That composure was tested again only 2 days later, when she came upon Priscilla in the long gallery, standing before a portrait of the late Duke, Julian's father, with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. Priscilla turned at the sound of her footsteps and did not bother to disguise the coolness in her greeting. She remarked, in that same sweetly pitched voice she had used at supper, that it must be a relief for Eleanor to have found such comfortable lodgings after her misfortune, and that she wondered how long comfort of that kind tended to last, once a household's true priorities reasserted themselves. Eleanor understood the warning beneath the words well enough, and answered only that she was grateful for every kindness shown to her, and hoped never to overstay it. Priscilla's smile thinned at the calm reply, and she left without another word, but Eleanor stood alone in the gallery for some time afterward, studying the portrait Priscilla had been examining, a stern-faced man who bore little resemblance to his son's quieter watchfulness, and wondering what exactly Priscilla believed she stood to lose. That night, lying awake in the unfamiliar comfort of her borrowed room, Eleanor found herself thinking not of Edmund, whose betrayal already felt distant and almost unreal, but of the Duke's quiet defense of her at the table, the unexpected gentleness of his question about her school, and the strange, unsettling comfort of being defended by a man who had known her for less than a week. A stranger arrived at Camden House on a rain-soaked afternoon, and Eleanor knew, the moment she saw his face through the window, that her carefully rebuilt peace was about to end. She had been reading to the Duchess in the small drawing room when the sound of hooves on gravel drew her attention, and she looked up to see a hired carriage stopping before the front steps, far less grand than anything belonging to the household. A man stepped down, adjusting his coat against the rain, and Eleanor's stomach dropped as she recognized him at once. It was Gerald Finch, a solicitor's clerk who had once handled correspondence between her aunt's household and Edmund's family. The Duchess, noticing her sudden stillness, asked sharply what was wrong. Eleanor could only say that she recognized the visitor, and that his presence here, so far from anywhere she had ever known him to travel, could not be a coincidence. She was summoned to the study within the hour. The Duke stood near the window as he had on her first evening in the house, and Gerald Finch sat stiffly in a chair before the desk, his hat in his hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable to find himself in such company. He rose when Eleanor entered and offered a short, formal bow, though his eyes would not quite meet hers. The Duke explained in his usual measured tone that Mr. Finch had arrived requesting to speak with Eleanor privately regarding matters connected to Edmund Hale, but that given the circumstances of her arrival at Camden House, he had thought it proper to be present for the conversation himself. Eleanor, grateful not to face this alone, nodded and took the seat offered to her. Finch cleared his throat and began haltingly. He explained that he had come on his own initiative, without his employer's knowledge, because his conscience would not allow him to stay silent any longer. He had overheard conversations, in the weeks before the wedding was to take place, between Edmund and his father, discussing the family's mounting debts and the need for a marriage that would bring real fortune into the estate, rather than the modest inheritance Eleanor had once been promised by her own family. Eleanor felt the old humiliation rise in her chest again, sharper this time, now that she understood the shape of it. She asked, her voice steadier than she felt, whether Edmund had always intended to leave her at the station, or whether the decision had come suddenly. As Finch hesitated, glancing briefly at the Duke before answering, he said that as far as he understood, the decision had been made only days before the journey, once a wealthier match had been secured through a family connection. He believed Edmund had lacked the courage to tell her directly, and had chosen instead to simply disappear, trusting that the shame of the abandonment would keep her from pursuing the matter or speaking of it widely. The Duke's expression darkened at this, though he said nothing yet. Eleanor pressed further, asking Finch why he had traveled so far to tell her this now, when the damage, as far as anyone could see, was already done. Finch's answer surprised her. He said he had heard, through servants' gossip that traveled faster than any formal correspondence, that a rumor was beginning to circulate suggesting Eleanor herself had orchestrated the entire abandonment as a scheme to secure the Duke's attention and fortune. He had come, he said, because he could not in good conscience let such a story spread unchallenged when he knew the truth of what had actually happened. Eleanor sat very still, processing the full weight of what he had just told her. Not only had Edmund abandoned her deliberately, but someone, somewhere, had already begun twisting the story into something far more damaging, something that painted her not as a victim but as a schemer. She asked who might have started such a rumor. Finch admitted he did not know for certain, but that it seemed to have begun somewhere near Camden House itself, rather than from her aunt's circle or anywhere connected to Edmund's family. The Duke's jaw tightened at this, and Eleanor understood, without either of them saying the name aloud, exactly whom they both suspected. After Finch departed, promising to send written confirmation of what he had shared should Eleanor ever need it for her own protection, the Duke remained standing by the window for a long while, saying nothing. Eleanor waited, unsure whether to speak first, until finally he turned and told her, with quiet anger, that he would not tolerate such rumors spreading from within his own household, whatever their source. Eleanor asked him plainly if he believed Priscilla responsible. The Duke did not answer directly, but the look on his face told her enough. He said only that he intended to speak with his cousin, and that Eleanor should not concern herself further with the matter for the present. But Eleanor could not simply set it aside. That evening, unable to sleep, she walked the quiet halls of the house, past portraits and darkened doorways, trying to settle her racing thoughts. She found herself, without quite meaning to, near the door of the library, where a thin line of candlelight still showed beneath the frame. She hesitated, then knocked softly. The Duke's voice bid her enter, and she found him seated near the fire, a glass of brandy untouched beside him, staring into the flames with the same troubled expression he had worn since Finch's departure. He looked up when she entered and, after a moment, gestured for her to sit. They spoke for a long while that night, more openly than they had before. The Duke admitted that he had long suspected Priscilla's ambitions ran deeper than simple fondness for the family name, but that he had never imagined she would go so far as to threaten an innocent woman's reputation to protect them. Eleanor, in turn, found herself confiding things she had not planned to share, her fear of returning home in disgrace, her uncertainty about a future that no longer resembled anything she had once imagined for herself, and beneath it all, a growing awareness that she trusted this quiet, guarded man more than she had trusted almost anyone in her life, despite having known him only a matter of weeks. At one point, the fire cracking softly between them, the Duke asked her directly whether she regretted the day her carriage, as he put it, though it had of course been Edmund's failure that set it in motion, had ever crossed paths with his own. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering. She said that she could not yet call anything about the past weeks fortunate, given all she had lost, but that she did not regret the kindness she had found in this house, however strange and unexpected its circumstances. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful composure, and said quietly that he was glad to hear it, because he found himself, against every instinct of caution he usually kept, increasingly unwilling to imagine the house without her in it. Eleanor did not know how to answer such an admission, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence charged with something neither was yet ready to name. It was the Duke who broke it first, rising abruptly and saying, in a voice gone formal again, that it grew late, and that she should rest before the household woke. Eleanor understood the retreat for what it was, a man drawing back from a feeling he had not intended to reveal, and she rose as well, bidding him good night, before the moment could grow any more complicated than it already had. The following morning, The household felt different, charged with a tension Eleanor could not quite name. Priscilla did not appear at breakfast, and when Eleanor asked a passing maid whether she was unwell, the girl only lowered her eyes and said that Miss Vane had been summoned to speak with the Duke early that morning, and had not yet emerged from his study. Eleanor spent the morning with the Duchess, who seemed to know more than she let on, watching Eleanor over her needlework with an expression of quiet, satisfied curiosity, though she offered no explanation when Eleanor asked what had happened. Only when the two of them walked together in the garden that afternoon did the old woman finally speak plainly. "My grandson," she said, "has never in his life confronted Priscilla directly about anything, preferring always to let her ambitions burn themselves out on their own. That he did so this morning, and did so on your behalf, tells me a great deal more about his feelings than anything he would ever say to my face." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, and tried to protest that the Duke had simply been protecting his household's reputation, nothing more. The Duchess laughed her short, sharp laugh and told her not to insult either of their intelligence by pretending she believed that. Priscilla reappeared at supper that evening, pale and unusually quiet, her earlier sharpness dulled into something more careful. She said little throughout the meal, and when her eyes did meet Eleanor's across the table, there was no warmth in them, but neither was there the open hostility of before. It seemed, whatever had passed between her and the Duke that morning, some line had been drawn that even Priscilla did not dare cross again so openly. Eleanor did not know, as she retired that night, that the line drawn that morning would not hold for long, nor that Priscilla, denied one avenue of attack, would soon find another, far more dangerous, one that would not stay contained within the walls of Camden House. In the days that followed, the household seemed to breathe a little easier, though Eleanor remained watchful, unwilling to trust the quiet too fully. She spent her mornings with the Duchess as before, but found the old woman increasingly inclined to speak of her grandson, dropping small observations into their conversations as though testing what reaction they might draw. He was not always so guarded, the Duchess told her one morning, threading a needle with fingers that trembled slightly but had lost none of their precision. As a boy he had been quick to laugh, quick to speak his mind, before his father's death placed the weight of the title on shoulders far too young to carry it comfortably. He had learned, in the years since, to keep his opinions to himself, and his affections closer still, a habit the Duchess seemed to regard as both a necessary armor and a private tragedy. Eleanor asked, carefully, why the Duchess was telling her this. The old woman only smiled, the particular smile of someone who has decided not to answer a question directly, and returned to her needlework as though the conversation had never strayed anywhere significant at all. That afternoon, Eleanor found herself walking the eastern gardens alone, the Duchess having retired early for a rest her health increasingly demanded. The gardens here were less formal than the front approach to the house, given over to winding paths and old fruit trees, and Eleanor had come to favor them precisely because they felt less like a duke's property and more like somewhere she might have wandered on her own, in some other life. She came upon the Duke unexpectedly near the old stone wall at the garden's edge, his coat off despite the cool air, sleeves rolled, helping one of the gardeners lift a fallen branch clear of a flower bed. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, and for a moment, caught without his usual composure, he simply looked younger, less burdened, more like the boy the Duchess had described. He straightened and reached for his coat, looking faintly embarrassed to be found in such a state, but Eleanor told him, with more honesty than she had intended, that she preferred him this way, unguarded, to the formal figure who greeted visitors in the study. The Duke seemed startled by the remark, then, after a pause, allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since her arrival. They walked together along the garden wall, and the conversation, freed from the formality of the house, moved more easily than it had before. He asked about her plans for the school she had once imagined, and this time, rather than simply listening, he offered thoughts of his own, suggesting that a property near the village, currently standing empty, might suit such a purpose should she ever wish to pursue it in earnest. Eleanor laughed, surprised, and told him he spoke as though the matter were already decided, when in truth she had no means and no certainty of any future at all, beyond the next letter from her aunt. The Duke grew quiet at this, and after a moment said that he hoped, whatever her future held, it would not require her to abandon dreams simply because they proved inconvenient to someone else's plans. Eleanor understood the words carried more weight than their surface suggested, and did not trust herself to answer lightly. Their walk was interrupted by the arrival of a groundskeeper with an urgent question about the drainage of one of the lower fields, and the Duke excused himself with evident reluctance, promising to continue their conversation another time. Eleanor watched him go, then turned back toward the house, her thoughts considerably more tangled than they had been an hour before. It was on her way back through the side entrance that she encountered Priscilla again, standing near the servants' passage in a manner that suggested she had been waiting rather than simply passing through. Priscilla's earlier caution had returned in full, though something colder had replaced the sweetness she once used to disguise her hostility. She told Eleanor plainly that whatever understanding Eleanor believed she had reached with Julian, she should not mistake temporary kindness for anything permanent. Men like the Duke, she said, married for duty and title, not for gratitude toward women who happened to be convenient at the right moment. She reminded Eleanor, with deliberate cruelty, that she had arrived at Camden House with nothing, and that nothing was still, in the end, exactly what she would leave with, whatever fleeting attention she currently enjoyed. Eleanor felt the old sting of humiliation rise in her, sharper for how close it landed to fears she had not yet spoken aloud even to herself. But she had learned enough, in her weeks at Camden House, not to let Priscilla see the wound land. She answered only that she had never claimed any understanding with the Duke beyond his hospitality, and that she found it curious Priscilla spent so much energy warning her away from a claim she had never made. Priscilla's composure flickered at the calm reply, and she turned and left without another word. But Eleanor stood alone in the passage for some time afterward, her earlier hope tangled now with a fresh uncertainty. She thought of the Duke's words in the garden, his talk of dreams not needing to be abandoned, and wondered whether Priscilla's warning held some grain of truth beneath its cruelty, whether she was mistaking simple decency for something deeper because she wanted, more than she had admitted even to herself, for it to be true. That night at supper the Duke seemed distracted, answering questions from his steward about estate matters with less than his usual attention, his eyes drifting more than once toward Eleanor's end of the table. The Duchess noticed as well, and made no effort to hide her satisfaction, offering pointed remarks about the pleasantness of long garden walks that made both Eleanor and the Duke uncomfortable enough to change the subject twice. After supper, as the household began to disperse for the evening, the Duke found a moment to speak with Eleanor privately in the hall, away from Priscilla's watchful eyes. He told her, somewhat awkwardly, that he had given further thought to the property near the village, and that should she wish to see it for herself, he would be glad to arrange a visit, purely as a matter of practical interest, nothing more. Eleanor thanked him, understanding that beneath the careful, practical phrasing lay something neither of them was yet prepared to name outright. She agreed to the visit, and as she climbed the stairs to her room that night, she found herself thinking not of Edmund, nor even of Priscilla's warnings, but of the unguarded smile she had glimpsed in the garden, and the strange, growing certainty that whatever future awaited her now, it had very little to do with the wedding she had once believed she was traveling toward. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to the Duke in a hand Eleanor did not recognize, and by the time she learned what it contained, the household had already begun to change around her. She had spent the morning at the empty property near the village, walking through its dusty rooms with the Duke beside her, imagining aloud where desks might sit, where a fire might warm a classroom on cold mornings, and for the first time in weeks she had allowed herself to speak of the future, without qualifying every sentence with uncertainty. The Duke had listened with real attention, asking practical questions about numbers of pupils and hours of instruction, and Eleanor had returned to Camden House that afternoon, lighter than she had felt in a very long time. That lightness did not survive the evening. She was summoned to the study again, and found the Duke standing exactly as he had on the night Finch arrived, though his expression this time carried something closer to controlled fury than mere concern. He held a letter in his hand and, without preamble, told her that it had come from a distant cousin of his, a woman with connections throughout fashionable society, warning him that a story had begun circulating widely, far beyond the village now, claiming that Eleanor Whitmore had deliberately arranged her own abandonment at the station, in order to draw the Duke of Camden's sympathy and secure his fortune. Eleanor felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her. She asked how such a detailed and specific story could have spread so far, so quickly, when only a handful of people even knew the particulars of her arrival. The Duke's jaw tightened, and he said grimly that the details were precise enough, and cruel enough, that he had no doubt of their origin, whatever denials might follow. He did not need to say Priscilla's name. Eleanor understood it already. The Duke explained that the letter suggested the story had originated from a conversation overheard at a dinner party, some distance from Camden House, one that Priscilla had attended without his knowledge just days before. Someone, it seemed, had repeated the tale with enough conviction and enough invented detail that it was now traveling through drawing rooms and dinner tables as established fact, growing more elaborate with each retelling, as such stories always did. Eleanor sat down heavily, her earlier hope curdling into something closer to dread. She asked the Duke what could possibly be done now if the story had already spread this far. He said only that he intended to confront Priscilla directly and demand she retract whatever she had said, though he admitted, with visible frustration, that a retraction rarely traveled as fast or as far as the original scandal. The confrontation, when it came the following morning, was heard by half the household despite taking place behind closed doors. Eleanor, waiting anxiously in the small drawing room with the Duchess, listened to the rise and fall of raised voices from down the hall, unable to make out words but unmistakably aware of their anger. When the Duke finally emerged, alone, his expression was grim in a way Eleanor had not yet seen from him. He told her only that Priscilla had denied any wrongdoing, insisting she had merely repeated concerns others had already been whispering, and that she could not be held responsible for how a story grew once it left her hands. He did not believe her denial, he said plainly, but without clearer proof, he could not force a confession from her, and forcing the issue further risked drawing even more attention to a scandal he was trying desperately to contain. The Duchess, listening from her chair, said what Eleanor herself had been afraid to voice aloud. Whatever proof existed or did not, the damage was already spreading, and no amount of private confrontation would undo whispers already traveling through drawing rooms Eleanor had never even visited. Over the following days, Eleanor began to feel the change in how the household regarded her. Servants who had grown friendly over the past weeks now seemed careful in her presence, as though uncertain how to behave around a woman whose reputation had become a matter of open speculation beyond these walls. A letter arrived from her aunt, its tone strained and anxious, asking pointed questions about the nature of her stay at Camden House, and whether the rumors reaching even their own quiet corner of the country held any truth. Eleanor wrote back at once, denying everything plainly, but she understood, reading her aunt's careful, worried phrasing, that even family loyalty had its limits when faced with sustained public scandal. The Duke, for his part, grew more protective rather than more distant, a fact that surprised Eleanor given how carefully he had guarded his household's reputation from the very beginning. He began accompanying her more openly through the house and gardens, as though daring anyone watching to draw further conclusions from behavior he no longer troubled himself to hide. The Duchess observed this shift with quiet satisfaction, remarking to Eleanor one afternoon that her grandson had apparently decided that protecting her mattered more to him than protecting his own reputation from further talk, which the old woman considered, in her own words, rather a significant admission for a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly that kind of exposure. Eleanor tried to caution him, aware that his open support only fed the very story Priscilla had set loose. She told him one evening, as they walked the same garden path where he had first shown her his unguarded smile, that she would understand if he thought it wiser to distance himself from her until the rumors settled, whatever the coldness of the decision might imply. The Duke stopped walking at this and turned to face her directly, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. He told her that he had spent years guarding every word and gesture against exactly the kind of scandal now threatening to attach itself to his name, and that he had done so not out of genuine caution but out of habit, a habit built on the fear of ever caring about anything, or anyone, enough to risk real loss. He said that meeting her, watching her endure abandonment and humiliation with more grace than most people managed in comfort, had made him question whether the careful, guarded life he had built for himself was worth the cost of never truly living within it. Eleanor did not trust herself to speak for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over her like the first real warmth she had felt since the wedding that never happened. She told him, finally, that she had not come to Camden House looking for anything beyond shelter for a single night, and that she had certainly never imagined finding a man willing to risk his own standing to defend a stranger's honor. The Duke, closing the distance between them slightly, said quietly that she was no longer a stranger, and had not been for some time now. The moment held between them, fragile and unfinished, until the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path broke it apart. A footman arrived, breathless, to inform the Duke that an unexpected visitor had arrived at the front of the house, a gentleman claiming urgent business regarding Miss Whitmore, and refusing to state his purpose to anyone but the Duke himself. Eleanor's stomach dropped, certain, before she even reached the front hall, of exactly who waited there. She was right. Standing near the entrance, his coat travel-stained and his expression carrying the particular discomfort of a man expecting an unwelcome reception, was Edmund Hale. The Duke's entire manner shifted the moment he saw him, the openness of the garden replaced instantly by cold, formal restraint. Eleanor felt her own composure struggling to hold as Edmund's eyes found hers across the hall, and for the first time since the platform, since the empty track and the vanished trunk, she found herself face to face with the man who had left her there. Edmund stepped forward, removing his hat with an awkwardness that suggested he had rehearsed this moment, and found the rehearsal insufficient now that it had arrived. He said her name, then hesitated, glancing at the Duke as though only now recognizing the full weight of the company he had walked into. He explained, stumbling slightly over the words, that he had heard the rumors circulating about her, and that his conscience would not allow him to remain silent while a story he knew to be false continued spreading unchecked. Eleanor found the claim almost impossible to credit, given that his own silence, his own vanishing act at the station, had created the very vacuum those rumors now filled. She asked him plainly why he had not simply told her the truth that day, rather than disappearing without a word and leaving her to construct her own explanations out of nothing. Edmund's composure faltered further. He admitted, his voice dropping, that his father had arranged a more advantageous match in the weeks before the wedding, a match tied to a substantial settlement that would clear debts threatening the family estate, and that he had lacked the courage to face her with the truth directly. He had told himself, in the moment, that leaving quietly would spare them both a difficult scene, though he confessed now, standing in the Duke's hall with both of them watching him, that he understood how hollow that reasoning sounded spoken aloud. The Duke's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled in a way that carried more danger than shouting would have. He asked Edmund directly whether he had come to Camden House to apologize, or simply to protect his own conscience by delivering that apology in front of witnesses who could later testify to his supposed decency. Edmund's face colored, and he admitted, after a pause, that he had also hoped, by clearing Eleanor's name publicly, to quiet talk that had begun reaching even his own family's circle, talk that threatened to complicate the very match he had abandoned her for. Eleanor felt something in her chest that was not quite anger, and not quite relief, but a strange, clarifying calm. She told Edmund that she appreciated whatever small courage it had taken to come here at all, but that his explanation, however honestly delivered, changed very little about the damage already done. She said she did not require his apology to move forward with her life, and that she would rather he simply confirm the truth in writing, to be shared with anyone who continued to question her honesty, than stand here offering excuses that served his own comfort more than her reputation. Edmund, visibly startled by the steadiness of her response, agreed at once, and the Duke summoned his own solicitor to draft a statement on the spot, one Edmund signed without argument, acknowledging plainly that he had left Eleanor at the station of his own choice, for reasons entirely unconnected to any scheme or deception on her part, and that any rumor suggesting otherwise was false. When the document was signed and witnessed, Edmund lingered a moment longer, as though hoping for some final word of forgiveness that would ease his own conscience further. Eleanor offered him none, only a polite, final farewell, and watched as the Duke's footman showed him back out to his waiting carriage. Once the door closed behind him, the tension that had gripped the hall eased, though not entirely. The Duke turned to Eleanor and asked, with unexpected gentleness, whether she was truly as composed as she had appeared, or whether the performance had cost her more than she let show. Eleanor admitted, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed, that it had cost her a great deal, but that she was glad, fiercely glad, to have faced it with her dignity intact rather than her silence. The Duke reached out, briefly, and took her trembling hand in his, a gesture more intimate than anything that had passed between them before, and told her that he had never in his life been prouder to stand beside anyone. Eleanor did not pull away. The signed statement was copied and sent within the week to Eleanor's aunt, to the cousin who had first warned the Duke of the spreading rumor, and to several other households where Priscilla's version of events had taken root. It did not silence every whisper, but it planted, at last, a competing truth, strong enough to make people pause, before repeating the old story without question. Priscilla, when she learned of Edmund's signed confession, said nothing at all, though her absence from supper that evening spoke plainly enough of her fury. Eleanor understood, watching the empty chair at the table, that the confrontation with Edmund had closed one danger, only to leave another, quieter one very much still alive within these same walls, and that Priscilla, denied one weapon, would not rest long before reaching for another. Later that night, unable to settle despite the day's small victory, Eleanor sat by her window and watched the moon rise over the garden where she and the Duke had spoken so openly, only hours before Edmund's arrival. She thought of the trembling in her own hands, steadied at last by the Duke's quiet grip, and of the strange, unlikely distance she had traveled since the moment the train pulled away and left her standing with nothing at all. She did not yet know how much further that distance would need to stretch before the danger truly passed, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The invitation arrived a week later, gold-edged and formally worded, requesting the Duke of Camden's presence at a ball hosted by Lady Ashworth, one of the county's most influential hostesses, and Eleanor understood immediately that this was no ordinary evening event, but a test of everything Edmund's signed confession had tried to repair. The Duke informed her, over breakfast, that he intended to bring her along, not hidden away as though she were something to be ashamed of, but openly, as his guest, in full view of everyone who had spent the past weeks whispering about her. Eleanor felt a flutter of fear at the suggestion, aware that a public appearance, rather than settling the matter, might instead give Priscilla and anyone sympathetic to her a fresh stage on which to revive the old rumors. The Duke acknowledged the risk, but said plainly that hiding her away any longer would only lend credibility to the very story they had worked so hard to disprove. The Duchess, when consulted, agreed firmly with her grandson, declaring that scandal fed on silence and starved on confidence, and that Eleanor owed it to herself, whatever the risk, to walk into that ballroom with her head held as high as any woman present. Eleanor spent the days before the ball in a state of nervous preparation, fitted for a gown finer than anything she had ever owned, courtesy of the Duchess's insistence that she attend as a guest of standing rather than a poor relation borrowing charity. She practiced, in quiet moments, the composed expression she intended to wear no matter what whispers reached her ears, reminding herself that she had already survived worse than a room full of curious strangers. The evening of the ball arrived cold and clear, the sky bright with stars as the carriage carried them toward Lady Ashworth's grand house, its windows blazing with candlelight visible even from the long approach. Eleanor's stomach tightened with every passing minute, and the Duke, seated across from her, seemed to sense her nerves, reaching over at one point to take her gloved hand briefly in reassurance, though he said nothing, as though understanding that words would not help as much as the simple, steady presence of his hand. The ballroom, when they entered, fell into the particular hush that follows a subject of gossip walking unexpectedly into the very rooms where that gossip has been spreading. Eleanor felt every eye turn toward her, felt the ripple of whispered comments move through the crowd like wind through tall grass, but she kept her chin level and her expression composed, exactly as she had practiced, and walked beside the Duke as though she belonged there as surely as anyone else present. Lady Ashworth herself greeted them at the entrance, her manner carefully neutral, neither warm nor cold, the manner of a hostess reserving judgment until she saw how the evening unfolded. She mentioned, with practiced delicacy, that she had heard a great deal about Eleanor recently, and hoped the evening might offer a chance to separate fact from the various stories currently in circulation. Eleanor answered evenly that she hoped so as well, and that she was grateful for the opportunity to speak for herself, rather than remain a subject discussed only in her absence. The early part of the evening passed in careful, watchful conversation, small groups of guests approaching with polite questions that circled, without quite naming, the scandal everyone had come partly hoping to witness firsthand. Eleanor answered each inquiry honestly and without defensiveness, describing the abandonment at the station plainly, mentioning Edmund's signed confession when it seemed relevant, and refusing to either apologize for circumstances she had not created or perform false humility she did not feel. Slowly, she began to sense the room shifting in her favor, guest by guest, as her calm honesty proved harder to dismiss than the elaborate rumors that had painted her as a scheming opportunist. The Duke remained close throughout, not hovering protectively in a way that might suggest weakness on her part, but present, visibly attentive, a silent endorsement that carried significant weight among a crowd accustomed to reading exactly such signals. It was during a lull in the dancing, as Eleanor stood near the refreshment table catching her breath after a set of dances with the Duke that had drawn more attention than either of them anticipated, that Priscilla finally made her appearance. She arrived late, dressed with deliberate splendor, and moved through the ballroom with the confidence of a woman who believed she still held the advantage. She approached Eleanor directly, her smile fixed in place, and remarked, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, how remarkable it was that Eleanor had recovered so quickly from her supposed misfortune, quick enough, in fact, to secure not only shelter but apparently the very particular attentions of her host. Eleanor felt the old sting of the words, but she had rehearsed too many times, in the quiet of her own room, exactly how she intended to meet this moment when it came. She answered calmly that she was grateful for every kindness shown to her since her misfortune, and added, her voice carrying just as clearly as Priscilla's had, that she found it curious how detailed and specific certain rumors about that misfortune had managed to become, given how few people had actually witnessed the events themselves. The remark landed exactly as she intended. Several guests within earshot exchanged glances, the implication unmistakable even without a name attached to it. Priscilla's composure flickered, just slightly, and she opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, the Duke stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone nearby. He addressed the small gathered crowd directly, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man rarely heard to raise it. He stated plainly that Miss Whitmore had been the victim of a deliberate abandonment by a man who had since confirmed the truth of the matter in a signed statement, copies of which he would be glad to share with anyone still harboring doubts. He added, his eyes moving briefly, deliberately to Priscilla, that he had also traced the origin of certain more elaborate rumors regarding Miss Whitmore's supposed scheming, and found their source considerably closer to home than anyone present might expect. The words fell over the gathered guests like a stone into still water, ripples of realization spreading outward as people began to understand exactly whom the Duke was implicating. Priscilla's face drained of color, her earlier confidence collapsing entirely under the weight of open accusation delivered in front of half the county's most influential families. She attempted, weakly, to deny the implication, insisting she had merely repeated concerns others had voiced first, the same defense she had offered privately weeks before. But the Duke, showing no inclination toward mercy now that the moment had arrived, produced from his coat a letter he had apparently carried for precisely this purpose, one obtained from a servant at the dinner party where the rumor had first taken shape, confirming Priscilla as its original source. The ballroom fell into a silence far more damning than any amount of whispered gossip could have been. Priscilla, understanding at last that no further denial would save her, turned and left the room without another word, her exit watched by every guest present. Her reputation, Eleanor understood, likely damaged now beyond easy repair. Eleanor felt no triumph in the moment, only a tired, relieved release of tension that had been building for weeks. She turned to the Duke and asked quietly why he had chosen to expose Priscilla so publicly, rather than handling the matter privately as he had attempted before. He answered simply that private handling had already failed once, and that Eleanor deserved a public restoration of her name equal to the public damage that had been done to it, whatever the cost to his own family's reputation in the process. The remainder of the evening passed in a warmer atmosphere than Eleanor had dared hope for when the carriage first approached the house. Guests who had earlier approached with careful, testing questions now spoke to her with genuine warmth, several offering quiet apologies for having entertained the rumors at all. Lady Ashworth herself sought Eleanor out before the evening ended, remarking that she had rarely seen a scandal so thoroughly and publicly reversed, and that she hoped Eleanor would consider herself welcome in her home going forward, whatever the circumstances of her arrival in the county. It was well past midnight when the Duke's carriage finally carried them home, the same road they had traveled with such nervous tension only hours before now passing beneath a sky gone soft and quiet with stars. Eleanor, exhausted but lighter than she had felt in weeks, found herself studying the Duke's profile in the dim carriage light, thinking of everything he had risked that evening on her behalf, the careful reputation he had spent years protecting, offered up without hesitation the moment it stood between her and the truth. She asked him, softly, whether he regretted the exposure now that the immediate danger had passed, given how much talk the confrontation itself would surely generate in the days ahead. The Duke considered the question seriously before answering, and told her that he regretted nothing, that a reputation built on silence and careful avoidance had never truly satisfied him, and that he would rather be known now as a man who defended what mattered to him than one who protected his own comfort above all else. Eleanor did not trust herself to respond to such an admission with words alone, and so she said nothing, only reached across the small space between them and took his hand, holding it through the remainder of the quiet ride home, both of them understanding, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever remained unresolved between them could not stay unspoken very much longer. They arrived back at Camden House to find the household already astir with news of the evening, servants exchanging quiet, delighted whispers about Priscilla's public humiliation, though whether from genuine sympathy for Eleanor, or simple relief at seeing an often difficult mistress finally checked, Eleanor could not entirely tell. The Duchess, waiting up despite the late hour, greeted them with visible satisfaction, declaring the evening a triumph long overdue, and retired to bed only after extracting a promise from both of them to give her a full account of every detail in the morning. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room that night with her heart still unsettled, not from fear this time, but from the enormity of everything that had shifted in the space of a single evening. Her name, once dragged through whispered scandal, now stood publicly restored. Priscilla's threat, once so pressing, now lay in ruins behind her. And the Duke, whose careful reserve had first struck her as distant and formal on the night she arrived with nothing, had that very evening declared, before half the county, that her honor mattered more to him than his own carefully guarded peace. Eleanor woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere below stairs, and dressed quickly, curious and faintly uneasy, before making her way down to find the front hall in a state of quiet chaos. Trunks stacked near the door, and Priscilla, pale but composed once more, directing a footman with sharp, clipped instructions about which cases were to travel with her, and which were to be sent on later. The Duke stood a short distance away, arms folded, watching the departure with an expression that gave away little. When he noticed Eleanor at the top of the stairs, he crossed to explain quietly that Priscilla had decided, given the events of the previous evening, that her continued residence at Camden House was no longer tenable, and had arranged to remove herself to a distant relations' home in the north before the week was out. Eleanor asked whether he had insisted upon her departure, or whether the decision had been Priscilla's own. The Duke admitted it had been mutual, arrived at during a brief, entirely civil conversation that morning, in which he had made clear that whatever family loyalty had once sheltered her ambitions, it would not survive a second such episode. Priscilla, to her credit, he said, had not argued the point. As the last of the trunks were loaded, Priscilla approached the base of the stairs, pausing when she saw Eleanor watching from above. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Then Priscilla said, with none of her usual sweetness but also, for the first time, none of her cruelty either, that she supposed Eleanor had won, though she doubted Eleanor would find the victory as satisfying, in the long run, as she currently imagined. Eleanor answered simply that she had never wanted to win anything at all, only to be left in peace, and that she hoped, wherever Priscilla settled next, she might find something worth pursuing that did not require another woman's ruin to secure it. Priscilla studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable crossing her face, then turned without another word and climbed into the waiting carriage. Eleanor watched it pull away down the long drive, feeling not triumph, as Priscilla had predicted, but a quiet, uncomplicated relief. The household settled in the days that followed, into a calm it had not known since Eleanor's arrival. The Duchess declared the change in atmosphere a considerable improvement, and took to inviting Eleanor to sit with her in the mornings not merely as a companion assigned to the task, but, as she put it plainly, as someone whose company she had genuinely come to prefer over most of the family she had been born into. Eleanor also found herself, in the quiet aftermath of the scandal's resolution, returning often to thoughts of the empty property near the village, the one the Duke had shown her weeks before. With Priscilla gone and her own name restored, the future felt, for the first time since the train pulled away without her, like something she might actually be permitted to shape for herself, rather than something imposed upon her by other people's decisions. She mentioned this to the Duke one evening as they walked the garden path that had become, without either of them quite acknowledging it, a favored place for the conversations neither felt comfortable having indoors. He listened as she spoke of practical matters, of how many pupils the building might reasonably hold, of what modest fees might sustain it without excluding the very families who needed it most. And when she finished, he told her that he intended to speak with his steward about formalizing the arrangement, whatever shape it eventually took. Eleanor thanked him, then hesitated before asking a question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the ballroom, since the carriage ride home, since perhaps the very first night he had shown her that unguarded smile among the fallen branches of the garden wall. She asked what, exactly, he intended their arrangement to become, once the scandal had fully settled and society moved on to whatever new subject next captured its attention. She reminded him gently that she could not remain indefinitely as an unmarried guest under his roof, however innocent the arrangement, without eventually inviting exactly the kind of talk they had both worked so hard to silence. The Duke stopped walking at this, turning to face her fully in the fading evening light. He admitted that he had been turning the same question over in his own mind for weeks now, uncertain how to raise it without presuming too much upon feelings she had never explicitly confirmed. He said, his voice steadier than she expected given the visible weight of what he was about to say, that he did not wish for their arrangement to end in any quiet, practical resolution at all, but rather in something considerably more permanent, should she find herself willing to consider it. Eleanor felt her heart quicken, understanding the shape of what he was working toward even before he finished the thought. But before he could complete it, a servant appeared at the garden entrance, apologizing for the interruption, to inform the Duke that an urgent message had arrived from the city, one the messenger insisted could not wait until morning. The Duke's expression tightened with visible frustration at the timing, but duty, as always, proved impossible to ignore. He excused himself, promising Eleanor they would return to this conversation the moment his business allowed it, and followed the servant back toward the house, leaving Eleanor alone in the darkening garden, her heart still racing with words left unfinished and a future suddenly, thrillingly uncertain in a way that no longer frightened her at all. She did not yet know what tomorrow would bring, whether Priscilla's departure would prove permanent, or whether new complications would rise in its place. Whatever urgent business had called the Duke away so suddenly, but she understood, lying awake later that night in the quiet dark of her borrowed room, that whatever came next, she would not face it as the same frightened, abandoned woman who had once stood alone on a railway platform, with nothing but a torn glove in her hands. The urgent message that pulled the Duke away from the garden proved to be news of a different kind of danger entirely, one Eleanor had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. He found her at breakfast the next morning, his face drawn and tired, having spent much of the night in correspondence rather than sleep. He explained that the message had come from a solicitor representing his late father's estate, warning him that a distant relation, a cousin twice removed with a weak but technically valid claim to certain properties tied to the dukedom, had learned of the recent scandal surrounding Priscilla's departure, and intended to use the resulting instability to challenge the Duke's management of the estate in court, hoping the appearance of disorder within the household might strengthen an otherwise thin legal argument. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over her, certain that her presence, and the scandal that had followed her, had somehow opened this new vulnerability. The Duke, seeing her expression, told her firmly that the claim had nothing to do with her, that the cousin in question had been circling for opportunity for years, and that Priscilla's departure had simply given him a pretext to act sooner than he otherwise might have. Still, Eleanor could not entirely shake the feeling that the peace they had so recently won had already begun to fray at its edges. The following weeks proved difficult in ways different from the scandal that preceded them. The Duke spent long hours closeted with solicitors, reviewing documents and correspondence stretching back decades, determined to secure his position beyond any legal challenge. Eleanor saw less of him than she had grown accustomed to, and though he never once suggested her presence was unwelcome or inconvenient to his defense, she found herself wondering, in quiet moments, whether the burden of this new crisis might eventually make him reconsider the words he had left unfinished in the garden. The Duchess, watching her granddaughter's worry with characteristic bluntness, told Eleanor one afternoon not to mistake her grandson's distraction for retreat. He was not a man, the old woman said, who abandoned what he valued simply because circumstances grew complicated, and if Eleanor doubted that, she had not been paying close enough attention to everything he had already risked on her behalf. Eleanor busied herself during those uncertain weeks with the school, spending long mornings at the empty property near the village, sweeping dust from floors that had stood empty for years, measuring windows for curtains, and drawing up simple lesson plans in a notebook she carried everywhere. The work gave her something steady to hold on to while the larger question of her future hung unresolved above the household, and she found, to her quiet surprise, that she did not need the Duke's presence at every hour to feel purposeful. She had built something of her own, however modest, and that alone steadied her more than she expected. She grew close, during this time, with a widow from the village named Margaret Ellery, who had once trained as a governess before her husband's death left her with 3 children and no income, and who agreed eagerly to help Eleanor prepare the school for its eventual opening. Margaret spoke plainly and worked hard, and Eleanor found in her a friendship entirely separate from the tangled politics of Camden House, one built on nothing more complicated than shared purpose and mutual respect. It was, Eleanor realized one evening walking home from the school in the fading light, the first friendship she had made entirely on her own terms since arriving in the county, owing nothing to the Duke's protection or the household's charity. The legal challenge dragged on longer than anyone had anticipated. The distant cousin, a man named Frederick Pratt, proved more stubborn than the Duke's solicitors had initially expected, producing document after document in an attempt to muddy the clear line of inheritance that had governed the estate for generations. Eleanor watched the Duke grow thinner and more tired as the weeks passed, his usual careful composure fraying at the edges during the rare evenings they managed to share a meal together. She began, quietly, to fear that whatever understanding had been building between them in the garden might simply dissolve under the weight of everything else demanding his attention. She raised this fear only once, to the Duchess, who dismissed it with her usual sharpness, telling Eleanor that a man fighting to secure his family's future was not a man losing interest in the woman he intended to share that future with, but rather a man determined to ensure there would be something worth sharing once the fighting ended. Eleanor tried to hold on to the reassurance, though the uncertainty did not fully lift until the evening the Duke finally emerged from his study with the news that the matter had been resolved. Eleanor took some comfort in the words, though the uncertainty did not fully lift until an evening nearly 3 weeks later, when the Duke finally emerged from his study looking, for the first time in weeks, genuinely relieved rather than merely determined. He found Eleanor in the small drawing room, reading by the fire, and told her simply that the matter had been resolved. The cousin's claim dismissed, after a thorough review, revealed it rested on documents that had been misrepresented from the start. The estate was secure, and with it, Eleanor understood, whatever future the Duke had been quietly building toward before the interruption. He sat down across from her, looking suddenly younger than the exhausted man who had spent 3 weeks buried in legal correspondence, and told her that he did not wish to waste another single evening leaving important things unsaid simply because circumstances kept intervening. He reminded her of the conversation they had begun in the garden, the one interrupted before he could finish it, and asked whether she remembered the shape of what he had been trying to say. Eleanor told him she remembered every word of it, and had turned it over in her mind more times than she cared to admit during the weeks of silence that followed. The Duke, encouraged, rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before her, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the formal, guarded man who had first greeted her in this very house months before. He told her, plainly and without the careful reserve that had once defined nearly everything he said, that he had not sent the carriage back for her that first evening out of simple pity, whatever he might have claimed at the time. Something in the sight of her standing alone on that platform, refusing to weep in front of strangers despite everything she had lost, had struck him more deeply than he understood himself until much later. Every week since, watching her rebuild her composure, defend her own name with more grace than most people managed even in comfort, and offer kindness to his difficult grandmother when few others troubled themselves to try, had only confirmed what he had begun to suspect that very first night, that he had found in her something he had stopped believing he would ever find at all, a partner whose strength matched his own, and whose honesty he trusted more than anyone he had known in years. He asked her, formally now, whether she would consent to become his wife, not out of gratitude for shelter given, nor out of any practical convenience, but because he could no longer imagine the house, or his own future, without her in it. Eleanor, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide this time, told him that she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the unguarded smile in the garden and the moment he stood before half the county and risked his own reputation to defend her name, and that she could think of nothing in the world she wanted more than to accept. The Duke rose, drawing her up with him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the silence between them finally, fully resolved rather than charged with things unsaid. When he kissed her, it was gentle and unhurried, nothing like the frantic uncertainty of the weeks before, but something steadier, the beginning of a promise rather than the end of a crisis. The Duchess, informed of the engagement the following morning, declared herself entirely unsurprised and considerably relieved, remarking that she had begun to fear she would need to arrange the match herself if the two of them continued dancing around the obvious for much longer. She insisted on overseeing the wedding preparations personally, declaring that after everything Eleanor had endured to reach this point, she deserved a celebration equal to the difficulty of the road that had led her here. The wedding took place in early autumn, in the small stone chapel on the Camden estate, the same gardens where so much of their story had quietly unfolded, now dressed in the gold and amber colors of the changing season. Eleanor's aunt traveled to attend, her earlier anxious letters long since replaced by open delight at how thoroughly her niece's fortunes had turned. Lady Ashworth attended as well, along with several other guests from the ball where Eleanor's name had first been publicly restored. Each of them now counted among the household's genuine friends rather than merely curious observers. Margaret Ellery attended too, seated near the front at Eleanor's own insistence, along with her 3 children, who had grown fond of Eleanor over the months of preparing the schoolhouse together, and who watched the ceremony with wide, delighted eyes, clearly more interested in the prospect of cake to follow than the vows themselves. Eleanor had insisted on their presence over the faint disapproval of 1 or 2 more traditional members of the household, telling the Duke plainly that she did not intend to begin her married life pretending the friendships that mattered most to her were somehow beneath the occasion. The Duke had agreed without hesitation, remarking only that he had married her, precisely because she refused to bend to exactly that kind of small, unnecessary snobbery. The morning of the wedding had begun with its own small chaos, the Duchess directing servants with imperious energy despite her doctor's repeated warnings to conserve her strength, insisting that she had waited far too long for this particular day to spend it resting quietly in her chambers. Eleanor had found her, an hour before the ceremony, seated before a mirror while a maid arranged her hair, and the old woman had taken one look at Eleanor's reflection beside her own, and declared, with uncharacteristic softness, that she could not recall the last time this house had held so much genuine happiness within its walls, and that she intended to enjoy every moment of it, regardless of what her doctor thought about the exertion. Eleanor had knelt beside her chair then, taking the old woman's hands in her own, and thanked her, not merely for the wedding preparations, but for the months of companionship that had come before them, for the sharp honesty and unexpected tenderness that had made Camden House feel like a home, rather than a temporary shelter from the very first difficult weeks. The Duchess had waved the sentiment away with typical brusqueness, though her eyes had been unmistakably bright, and told Eleanor to save her tears for the ceremony itself, where they would at least have the excuse of tradition to explain them. Priscilla did not attend, though a brief, unexpectedly gracious note arrived from the north wishing the couple well, which the Duchess read aloud with visible surprise before declaring that people occasionally did manage to grow, however unlikely it seemed at the time. Eleanor read the note twice over afterward, in a quiet moment before the ceremony began, and found herself feeling nothing sharper than a distant, settled sympathy for the woman who had once seen her only as a threat to be removed. Whatever bitterness Priscilla had carried into that ballroom months before, it seemed, at least in this one small gesture, to have finally burned itself out. Edmund Hale sent no such note, and Eleanor had not expected one. She had heard, second-hand through her aunt's careful correspondence, that his own marriage had gone forward as his father intended, the wealthier match secured at the cost of whatever regard he might once have held for honesty or courage. Eleanor felt, hearing the news, neither anger nor satisfaction, only the quiet recognition that his choices, whatever they had cost her in the short term, had ultimately freed her to build something far better than anything he could have offered. The ceremony itself passed for Eleanor in a blur of warmth and quiet joy. The vicar's familiar words, the weight of the ring sliding onto her finger, the Duchess dabbing at her eyes despite her earlier insistence that she would not weep. When the vicar finally pronounced them married, the small chapel erupted into applause and delighted laughter, Margaret's children clapping loudest of all, and Eleanor felt, walking back down the aisle on her husband's arm, a happiness so complete it seemed almost impossible to hold within a single body. As Eleanor walked down the short aisle toward the man waiting for her at its end, she found herself thinking, briefly, of the platform where this entire unlikely story had begun. The empty track, the torn glove, the cold certainty that she had lost everything in a single afternoon. She thought of how impossible it would have seemed, standing there in the gathering dark with nothing to her name, that she would one day walk toward a marriage built not on desperation or convenience, but on genuine partnership, chosen freely by two people who had come to know and trust each other through hardship, rather than simple courtship. The Duke, watching her approach, wore an expression entirely unguarded now, the careful reserve of their first meeting replaced by open, unmistakable joy. When she reached him, he took her hands and told her, quietly, that he had been waiting his entire life, without knowing it, for exactly this moment. After the ceremony, as the small gathered crowd moved out into the garden for the wedding breakfast, Eleanor paused for a moment near the old stone wall where she and the Duke had first spoken so openly, watching the autumn light slant gold across the grounds that had become, over the course of one unlikely year, entirely her own home. She thought of the school near the village, already taking shape under her direction, its first small class of pupils due to begin lessons within the month. She thought of the Duchess, now settled comfortably in her role as doting grandmother-in-law rather than merely watchful observer. She thought of everything she had lost that afternoon at the railway station, and everything, entirely unexpected, that had grown in its place. The Duke found her there, slipping his hand into hers without a word, and together they watched the last of the wedding guests settle into the garden, the golden light deepening toward evening, exactly as it had on the night his carriage first returned for her, though nothing about the moment now carried even the smallest trace of the fear that had defined it then. She had been left at the railway station with nothing, and an hour later, a stranger's carriage had returned for her, carrying her toward a future she could never have imagined for herself. Standing now in the garden that had become her home, beside the man who had chosen her not out of pity but out of genuine steady love, Eleanor understood at last that the empty platform, the vanished trunk, the cold certainty of abandonment, had not been the end of her story at all, but only its unlikely, necessary beginning. Snow fell early that year, dusting the Camden Gardens white before the last of the autumn leaves had even finished falling, and Eleanor stood at the schoolhouse window, watching it settle over the fields beyond the village with a satisfaction she had never quite expected to feel toward weather. The school had opened 3 months earlier, on a bright September morning, with 12 pupils seated at desks the Duke's carpenters had built to Eleanor's own careful specifications. That number had grown steadily since, families from neighboring villages hearing of the modest fees and the genuine instruction offered, until Margaret Ellery, now employed properly as a second teacher rather than a volunteer, had begun gently suggesting they might soon need a second room. Eleanor turned from the window as the last of the afternoon's pupils gathered their things, calling farewells to each other as they bundled into coats against the cold. She helped the smallest among them, a solemn-faced boy named Peter who struggled more than the others with his letters but never once complained about the effort, wind his scarf properly before sending him out into the early dark toward home. It was, she often thought, exactly the kind of small, steady work she had once feared she would never be permitted to pursue, and she found more contentment in it than she had imagined possible even in her happiest hours at Camden House. Margaret Ellery lingered a moment after the last pupil left, helping Eleanor straighten the rows of small desks and bank the schoolroom fire for the night. She mentioned, almost shyly, that her eldest daughter had asked, only that morning, whether she might one day help teach the youngest pupils their letters, an ambition Margaret had not expected from a girl of 11, but which she confessed made her prouder than almost anything else that difficult year had brought her. Eleanor told her warmly that she thought it a fine ambition indeed, and promised to set aside a few simple primers the girl might practice with over the coming months. Margaret thanked her, then gathered her own coat and stepped out into the thickening snow, for him a cheerful farewell over her shoulder as she went. Eleanor lingered a moment longer in the empty schoolroom, running her hand along the edge of the nearest desk, thinking of how quickly the building had filled with noise and purpose since its quiet, dusty beginning. She thought of the Duke's offer that first afternoon in the empty rooms, spoken almost carelessly, as though he had not yet understood how much the small kindness would come to mean to her, and felt, even now, a fresh rush of gratitude for the ordinary, steady life that offer had eventually made possible. The Duke arrived as she was locking the schoolhouse door, having ridden down from the estate himself rather than sending the carriage, snow dusting his shoulders and his breath visible in the cold air. He had taken, in the months since their marriage, to meeting her at the end of the school day whenever his own duties allowed it, and Eleanor had come to treasure the short walk home they shared together, unhurried and private, away from the watchful eyes of the household. He asked how the day had gone, and Eleanor told him about Peter's slow but genuine progress, about Margaret's suggestion of expanding the building, about the small triumphs and small frustrations that made up the shape of her days now. The Duke listened with the same real attention he had shown from their very first conversation over breakfast months before, and Eleanor thought, walking beside him through the softly falling snow, that this quiet, ordinary happiness was worth infinitely more than anything the grand ballrooms of the county could have offered her. They spoke, as they walked, of the Duchess, whose health had grown more uncertain as winter approached, though her sharpness of mind remained entirely undiminished. She had taken to spending her afternoons in the schoolhouse whenever the weather permitted, delighting the younger pupils with stories of her own girlhood, and offering opinions on their handwriting with the same blunt honesty she applied to everything else. Eleanor worried, quietly, about how much longer those visits might continue, though she kept the worry mostly to herself, unwilling to darken the season with fears that had not yet come to pass. The Duke mentioned, as they reached the edge of the estate grounds, that a letter had arrived that morning from Eleanor's aunt, full of news from home and warm inquiries about the school's progress. Eleanor's aunt had visited twice since the wedding, each time marveling more openly at how settled and purposeful her niece had become, a far cry from the anxious young woman who had once written home from a Duke's borrowed room, uncertain how to explain her own circumstances. Eleanor smiled at the memory now, able at last to look back on those frightening early weeks without the old sting of humiliation attached to them. They passed the old stone wall in the garden, bare now of the summer growth that had once framed their early conversations, and Eleanor paused there, as she often did, remembering the afternoon she had first found the Duke helping his gardener clear a fallen branch, sleeves rolled and composure momentarily forgotten. He noticed her pause and asked, gently, what she was thinking of. She told him, and he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that still, even now, caught her by surprise with its warmth, and admitted that he thought of that same afternoon often himself, considering it, in hindsight, the moment he had first understood he was in real danger of loving her. That evening, over a quiet supper in the small dining room they had come to prefer over the grander formal hall, the Duchess joined them despite the cold, wrapped in shawls and declaring herself perfectly capable of managing a short walk from her rooms. She asked, between mouthfuls of soup, how the school's newest pupils were settling in, and listened with genuine interest as Eleanor described each child in turn, the shy ones and the boisterous ones, the quick learners and the ones who needed patience most of all. After supper, as the fire burned low and the Duchess retired early, pleading fatigue she would not have admitted to a stranger, the Duke and Eleanor remained in the drawing room, the snow still falling steadily beyond the windows. He told her, in a quiet moment between them, that he had received word that morning of Frederick Pratt's final withdrawal of any remaining legal claims against the estate, closing permanently the last thread of the crisis that had once threatened to unravel everything they were building together. Eleanor felt the news settle over her like a long exhaled breath, the last small shadow of that difficult year finally, fully lifted. She thought, sitting there beside her husband with the fire crackling low and the snow falling soft and steady outside, of everything the past year had asked of her: the abandonment at the station, the frightening uncertainty of arriving at a stranger's house with nothing to her name, the cruelty of rumors she had not deserved, and the slow, unlikely building of trust that had followed. She thought of Priscilla's bitter warning in the servants' passage, that nothing was still, in the end, exactly what she would leave with, and found herself, for the first time, able to consider the warning with something like gentle amusement rather than fear, given how thoroughly it had proven wrong. The Duke, watching her expression shift through these private reflections, asked what occupied her thoughts so completely. Eleanor told him honestly, describing the full arc of the year behind them, and he listened without interrupting, until she finished, at which point he reached for her hand and told her that he considered himself, whatever the difficulties along the way, the most fortunate man in the county for having glanced out a carriage window on exactly the right afternoon. Eleanor laughed at this, telling him that fortune had very little to do with it, that he had made a deliberate choice to turn that carriage around when countless other men would have simply continued on their way, unwilling to trouble themselves over a stranger's misfortune. The Duke considered this, then admitted she was likely right, that whatever instinct had prompted him that day, he had never once regretted following it, not through scandal, not through legal crisis, not through a single difficult moment of the year that had followed. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the gardens and the sleeping village beyond, over the schoolhouse where a dozen pupils would return in the morning to their lessons, over the quiet stone wall where two wary strangers had first begun, without quite realizing it, to fall in love. Eleanor sat beside her husband in the firelight, thinking of how far she had traveled from that cold railway platform, the torn glove, the vanished trunk, the certainty that she had lost everything in a single afternoon. She understood now, with a clarity that year of hardship had earned her, that she had lost nothing that truly mattered that day at all. She had lost only a future that had never been solid to begin with, a man whose loyalty had proven thinner than the promises he made, a life built on assumptions rather than genuine partnership. What she had found instead, through every difficult turn that followed, was something far more durable, a home built on honesty rather than convenience, a marriage chosen freely rather than settled into out of necessity, and a purpose entirely her own, standing now in a modest schoolhouse at the edge of the village, waiting for morning and the return of small, eager faces ready to learn. The fire burned low, and the snow kept falling, and Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Camden, closed her eyes against her husband's shoulder and allowed herself, at last, to simply rest in the quiet certainty of everything she had built and everything still waiting patiently ahead.